April 5th, 1531. Thousands gather at Smithfield, expecting another public execution. They had seen hangings before, burnings too, but nothing prepared them for what stood over the fire that morning. A massive iron cauldron, inside water rolling into a violent boil, and beside it, a terrified cook named Richard Roose, condemned by a law that did not even exist until the king created it specifically for him. By the end of the day, the crowd would hear screams so horrific that chroniclers recorded them with a single sentence. He roared mighty loud. England, in the early 1530s, was already a kingdom drowning in fear, suspicion, and political tension. Henry VIII sat on the throne, obsessed with securing a male heir, and equally obsessed with destroying anyone who stood in the way of his marriage plans. Across the country, people whispered about betrayals, secret alliances, and enemies hidden inside the royal court itself. But among all the dangers people feared, there was one crime that terrified Tudor society more than almost anything else. Poison. Not because it was common, because it was invisible. A sword could be seen, an assassin with a dagger could be stopped, but poison entered quietly. It slipped into kitchens, into cups, into bread and soup and wine. A trusted servant could murder an entire household without drawing a single weapon. And in Tudor England, where loyalty inside a household meant everything, that possibility struck at the heart of society itself. That fear exploded in February of 1531, inside the home of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. Fisher was no ordinary bishop. He was one of the most respected churchmen in England, a scholar, a powerful voice in Parliament, and one of the few men brave enough to openly challenge Henry VIII. While most nobles and clergy bent under pressure, Fisher refused. He defended Queen Catherine of Aragon and condemned Henry's attempt to break his marriage apart. Every speech he gave made him more dangerous to the king's ambitions, and dangerous men in Tudor England often died suddenly. Fisher's residence at Lambeth functioned like many elite households of the time. Servants moved constantly through narrow kitchens and stone corridors. Fires burned from morning until night. Meals were prepared in enormous quantities, not only for the bishop and his guests, but also for the poor who gathered outside seeking food and charity. Then came the meal that changed English legal history forever. On February 18th, a thick pot of pottage was served from Fisher's kitchen. It looked ordinary, smelled ordinary. Nothing about it warned the people eating it that death had already entered the room. At first, the symptoms came slowly, then all at once. Guests began collapsing in agony. Stomachs twisted violently. Vomiting spread across the household. Panic tore through the dining chambers as servants realized something was terribly wrong. One member of Fisher's household, Bennet Kerwin, died after consuming the food. A poor woman named Alice Triet, who had only come seeking charity at the kitchen door, also died after eating from the same pot. And somehow, Fisher himself survived, not because he discovered the poison, not because someone warned him. According to records, he had simply lost his appetite after long hours of study and decided not to eat. That small decision may have saved his life. The household immediately turned toward the kitchen staff. Suspicion landed on the cook almost instantly. A man remembered by history under several different names: Richard Roose, Richard Rouse, sometimes simply Richard Cook. Even his real surname remains uncertain centuries later, as though history itself could not fully grasp who he truly was. But by then, Roose had already fled. That alone looked like guilt. He was hunted down elsewhere in London and dragged into custody. Soon he found himself imprisoned in the Tower of London, where Tudor interrogations were designed not to discover truth, but to force confessions. And eventually, under torture, Richard Roose broke. He admitted that he had added a mysterious white powder into the pottage. But his explanation confused everyone. Roose claimed he never intended to kill anybody. He said a stranger had given him the substance and told him it was merely a harmless purgative, something that would make people sick for a short time. According to his story, he intended it as a cruel prank against fellow servants, not mass murder. Whether anyone believed that explanation is another matter entirely, because two people were already dead, and the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the entire case became. The mysterious man who supposedly supplied the powder, vanished completely. No records identified him. The poison itself was never recovered. No accomplices were ever charged. And hanging over the entire investigation was one dangerous question nobody dared ask too loudly. Was Richard Roose really acting alone? Because John Fisher had enemies everywhere, powerful enemies, men connected directly to Henry VIII's inner circle, families desperate to remove Fisher as an obstacle to the king's marriage plans. Among them stood the rising Boleyn family, whose influence over Henry was growing stronger by the month. Soon, rumors spread through London like wildfire. People whispered that Fisher's poisoning had not been random at all. Some even claimed cannonballs had later been fired toward Fisher's property from the direction of Thomas Boleyn's residence, fueling even more suspicion. There was never actual evidence tying the Boleyns to the poisoning. None then, none now. But Tudor England did not need proof to create fear. It only needed motive. And suddenly, this was no longer just a poisoning inside a bishop's kitchen. It had become something far more dangerous. A crime tangled in royal politics, religious conflict, and the paranoia consuming Henry VIII's court. The king was listening closely. And what Henry VIII decided to do next would horrify even a country already accustomed to brutal death. Henry VIII did not treat the poisoning of John Fisher's household like an ordinary crime. He treated it like an attack on the entire structure of England itself. Only 10 days after the poisoning, the king personally appeared before the House of Lords. Contemporary accounts describe Henry speaking for more than an hour, raging against poison as a form of murder unlike any other. A stabbing was visible, a hanging was public. But poison worked in silence. It turned trust into vulnerability. It transformed kitchens into battlefields. To Henry, that secrecy made the crime uniquely terrifying. And then he made a decision so extreme that it stunned Parliament. He rewrote the law. In 1531, a new act for poisoning was passed. Under this law, murder by poison would no longer be treated as ordinary homicide. Instead, it became an act of treason against society itself. And attached to that law was a punishment England had almost never used before: death by boiling alive. The symbolism was deliberate. A man accused of using cooking to kill would himself be cooked to death before the public. It was not merely execution, it was spectacle, a warning designed to burn itself into the minds of everyone who heard about it. But the legal process surrounding Richard Roose became almost as disturbing as the punishment waiting for him. He never received a normal trial. No jury examined evidence. No defense was formally presented. Instead, Parliament used a procedure called attainder, essentially declaring Roose guilty through legislation itself. His sentence was written directly into law. The king and Parliament had decided his fate before he ever stood inside a courtroom. For historians, that moment became incredibly important, because before Richard Roose, parliamentary attainders were usually reserved for dangerous nobles and political conspirators, powerful men whose influence made ordinary trials risky. But now, the government had used the same mechanism against a simple cook. And that precedent would not disappear. In the years ahead, Henry VIII's government would use similar legal methods against queens, ministers, theologians, and rivals who threatened the crown. The machinery first tested on Richard Roose would eventually help fuel some of the most infamous political executions in English history. Meanwhile, Roose remained imprisoned inside the Tower of London, fully aware of what awaited him. No priest would comfort him. The new law specifically stripped him of the right to final confession, or last rites. In Tudor England, where salvation and religion shaped every aspect of life, that punishment carried enormous spiritual terror. To die outside the church's protection was almost as horrifying as the execution itself. And then came April 5th, 1531. Smithfield. For generations, Smithfield had served as one of London's great theaters of death. Crowds gathered there to watch heretics burn or criminals hang. Executions were public events, woven into the rhythm of Tudor life. Vendors sold food nearby. Spectators pushed for better views. Death was familiar entertainment. But what stood waiting that morning was something entirely different. An enormous cauldron sat above an open fire. Inside, water churned and rolled in a violent boil. The crowd understood immediately that they were about to witness something no living Englishman had ever truly seen before. Richard Roose was brought forward. No surviving account records his final words. No speech, no dramatic plea for mercy. History becomes strangely silent at the exact moment his life reached its end. What sources do describe are the mechanics of the execution itself. Some accounts suggest he was suspended by chains and lowered gradually into the boiling water. Others imply he may have been repeatedly raised and plunged back down again. Either way, death was not instant. Boiling alive was designed to prolong agony, not shorten it. Then came the screams. One contemporary account recorded the moment with chilling simplicity. He roared mighty loud. That was all. No elaborate description, no attempt at poetry, just those words, written by someone who likely could not fully process what they had witnessed. And perhaps the most revealing detail of all was the reaction of the crowd. These were people accustomed to public violence. They had watched burnings, beheadings, hangings. Many would have attended executions since childhood. Yet witnesses described spectators recoiling in horror at what they saw happening to Roose inside that cauldron. For once, Tudor brutality had crossed a line even Tudor England found difficult to stomach. Eventually, the screams stopped. Richard Roose disappeared from history almost the same way he entered it. Uncertain, mysterious, half obscured by conflicting records and unanswered questions. Nobody ever discovered the identity of the stranger who allegedly gave him the poison. Nobody proved whether powerful figures had manipulated the entire case from the shadows. And nobody could say with certainty whether Roose had truly intended murder or had become the perfect scapegoat for a terrified government, desperate to make an example of someone. But the story did not end with his death. John Fisher, the man supposedly targeted by the poisoning, survived the attack only to face Henry VIII again years later. In 1535, Fisher refused to recognize the king as supreme head of the Church of England. For that defiance, Henry ordered him executed, this time by the axe. The bishop who escaped poisoned pottage could not escape the crown forever. As for the punishment of boiling alive, England itself soon recoiled from it. Under Henry's son, Edward VI, the law was repealed. Even by the standards of Tudor justice, boiling a man alive had been judged too extreme, too horrifying, too far beyond the limits of acceptable punishment. And yet the legal weapon created around Richard Roose survived long after the cauldron disappeared. Parliamentary attainder became one of the Tudor monarchy's deadliest tools. A same system used against a cook accused of poisoning porridge would later help destroy some of the most powerful people in England. That may be the strangest part of the entire story. Richard Roose was not a king, not a nobleman, not a military commander. He was a servant working in a kitchen. Yet his case helped reshape how the English crown exercised fear, punishment, and absolute authority. For one terrifying moment in 1531, the Tudor state wanted the public to witness something unforgettable. Not simply death, but suffering elevated into spectacle. A warning so brutal that it would silence questions before they were even asked. And standing around that cauldron at Smithfield, watching steam rise into the cold London air, the crowd understood exactly what the king wanted them to understand. Some punishments were not meant merely to kill, they were meant to terrify an entire nation. Lessons for us from this history. 1. Fear can make governments dangerous. When people are afraid, governments often create extreme laws in the name of security or justice. Henry VIII didn't just punish one person. He wanted to use fear to control an entire nation. 2. Laws created in anger often outlive the moment. The laws created for Richard Roose later became weapons for many other political executions. Modern audiences will easily connect with this idea. Once a government has emergency power, it can later become more dangerous. 3. Public cruelty slowly becomes entertainment. The crowd at Smithfield came to see the execution as entertainment. The story shows that when people get used to seeing suffering, society becomes morally numb. 4. Truth becomes blurry when politics controls justice. It's still not certain whether Roose was really guilty, but fear plus politics plus propaganda combined to make him an example. It reminds modern audiences how easily public opinion can be manipulated. 5. Absolute power always.